I'm 28, and last March my grandfather Walter passed away at 84. I was his only grandkid who actually stayed in touch with him. The rest of the family had basically written him off as a weird, reclusive old man who lived alone in a rundown house in rural Oregon. Walter wasn't warm or grandfatherly. He never came to holidays, barely talked when you called him, and had this way of looking at you like he was somewhere else entirely. My mom, his daughter, had a complicated relationship with him, and my uncle hadn't spoken to him in over a decade. But I liked Walter. He was quiet, but when he did talk, he said interesting things. He'd been a machinist at a factory for 40 years before retiring, lived simply, and seemed content with his solitary life. We'd have coffee together every few months, and he'd tell me stories about fixing old motorcycles or the weird birds that came to his feeders. When Walter died, he left me his house and everything in it. My mom and uncle were actually relieved. Neither of them wanted to deal with cleaning out what they assumed would be a hoarder situation. Except Walter's house wasn't a hoarder situation. It was something much, much stranger. Walter's house was a small, plain rancher on 5 acres outside Eugene, Oregon. From the outside, it looked exactly like what you'd expect from a retired factory worker living alone. Slightly shabby, needed paint, overgrown yard. But when I walked inside to start the clean-out, nothing made sense. The front part of the house was what I expected. Old furniture, outdated appliances, the general clutter of someone who'd lived in the same place for decades. But it felt staged somehow, like a set design of what an old person's house should look like. Then I found the locked door. It was in Walter's bedroom, behind his dresser, a regular interior door, but with 3 deadbolts installed on it. The key was in Walter's nightstand. Actually, there were 3 keys, each labeled with a number. I unlocked the door, expecting maybe a closet full of old junk or possibly something embarrassing that Walter had wanted to keep private. Instead, I found a staircase leading down. Walter's house had a basement, which shouldn't have been surprising, except I'd been to this house dozens of times and never knew there was a basement. The floor plan didn't suggest one. There were no other basement access points. I went down the stairs and found myself in a completely different world. The basement wasn't a basement. It was a full apartment. And not a dingy, unfinished basement apartment. This was a fully furnished, climate-controlled living space with a bedroom, bathroom, kitchenette, living area, and what looked like an office. Everything down there was new and expensive. Leather furniture, modern appliances, high-end electronics. There was art on the walls, real art, not prints. The books on the shelves were first editions. The rugs were hand-woven. I stood in the middle of this secret apartment, trying to understand what I was seeing. Walter was a retired factory worker who lived on Social Security and a small pension. He drove a 15-year-old truck and bought his clothes at Walmart. Where did this come from? I started looking through the office, and that's when things got really weird. There were filing cabinets full of documents, financial statements, property deeds, business contracts, all in Walter's name, but none of them matching the person I knew. Walter owned properties, multiple properties, in Oregon, Washington, and California. According to these documents, he had been collecting rental income for decades. Walter had investment accounts with 7-figure balances. He had a safety deposit box at a bank I'd never heard him mention. He had business partnerships and LLC formations. My grandfather, who I thought lived on $1,800 a month in Social Security, was a multi-millionaire. But that wasn't even the strangest part. In the desk drawer, I found photo albums, pictures of Walter, looking younger, with people I didn't recognize. A woman who wasn't my grandmother, children who weren't my mom or uncle, birthday parties, holidays, graduations, An entire life documented in photographs. The photos were dated. The most recent ones were from 6 months before Walter died. My grandfather had a second family, and unlike his relationship with us, he looked happy in these photos, really genuinely happy in a way I'd never seen him in person. I sat down in Walter's secret office and tried to piece together what I was looking at. It felt like discovering that Clark Kent was Superman, except instead of saving the world, Walter had been living an entire alternate life that none of us knew about. That's when I found the letter. It was in an envelope on the desk with my name on it, in Walter's handwriting. Inside was a single page, typed, with Walter's signature at the bottom. Thomas, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you found my real life. I'm sorry for the deception, but I had my reasons. There's more to understand, and you'll find it if you keep looking. The safety deposit box key is in the red book. The password to my computer is your birthday. I trust you to do the right thing with what you find. Walter. I looked around the secret apartment at the evidence of wealth and a hidden family and realized I didn't know my grandfather. And apparently, he'd known I'd be the one to find all of this.
I spent the next 3 days practically living in Walter's secret basement, going through everything and trying to piece together his hidden life. The computer password worked, 0724 for July 24th, my birthday. Walter's files were meticulously organized, like everything else about his secret life. What I found was a 40-year timeline of systematic deception that was both impressive and heartbreaking. Walter married my grandmother Helen in 1962. They had 2 kids, my mom in 1964 and my uncle in 1967. By all accounts, it was a normal working-class family in Eugene. Walter worked at the Weaver Machine Company, Helen was a school teacher, and they lived in a modest house. Then, in 1979, Walter's father died and left him a property, a 40-acre parcel outside Seattle that had been in the family for generations. Walter sold it for $180,000, which in 1979 was a massive amount of money. According to his journals, yes, Walter kept detailed journals, he'd wanted to invest that money, quit his factory job, and start a business. Helen wanted to use it to buy a bigger house and put the kids through college. They fought about it for months, and Helen ultimately gave Walter an ultimatum: invest the money in their family or she'd divorce him. So Walter did something that I still can't quite wrap my head around. He told Helen he'd put the money in conservative investments and that they'd live off his salary while it grew. But actually, he took that $180,000 and moved it to a separate bank, created a false paper trail showing much smaller returns, and started secretly investing it aggressively in real estate. Within 5 years, Walter had turned $180,000 into over $1 million buying and flipping properties during the early 80s real estate boom. But he couldn't tell anyone because he'd built this entire financial life on a lie to his wife. The journals from this period are painful to read. Walter wrote about feeling trapped between the life he'd built and the life he wanted. He loved his kids, but he felt suffocated by Hela's need for control and safety. He was making money hand over fist, but couldn't enjoy it or even acknowledge it existed. Then in 1985, Walter met someone named Caroline. Caroline Walsh was a real estate agent Walter worked with on some of his property investments. She knew about his money because she was helping him manage it. According to Walter's journals, Caroline was everything Helen wasn't: adventurous, ambitious, supportive of his business instincts. They started an affair, and Walter's journals show him spiraling into guilt and confusion. He didn't want to leave his kids, but he was miserable in his marriage. He'd built this secret fortune that he couldn't share with his own family. The solution Walter came up with was insane, but in a weird way, it worked. He told Helen he was taking a part-time consulting job that required frequent travel. Actually, he rented an apartment in Portland and started splitting his time between his two lives, Eugene 3 days a week, Portland 4 days a week. Walter married Caroline in 1987. Not legally, he was still married to Helen, but they had a commitment ceremony and she took his name. They had 2 kids together, a son in 1988 and a daughter in 1991. For the next 30-plus years, Walter lived as 2 different people. In Eugene, he was Walter Henderson, factory worker, living in a modest house with his wife Helen and visiting his adult kids and grandson. In Portland, he was Walter Walsh, successful real estate investor living in a nice house with his wife Caroline and their 2 kids. The logistics were insane. 2 homes, 2 families, 2 complete lives that never overlapped. Walter maintained this for decades through careful scheduling, elaborate lies, and what must have been an exhausting level of compartmentalization. The financial records showed how he pulled it off. The factory job was real. He worked there until he retired. But that money went to Helen and the Eugene household. The real estate money went to Caroline and the Portland household. Walter basically lived as a working-class guy in Eugene and an upper-middle-class guy in Portland. Helen died in 2003, never knowing about Caroline or the money. After Helen's death, Walter could have come clean or moved to Portland full-time. Instead, he kept both lives going, probably because by then his adult kids in Eugene, my mom and uncle, had their own families and lives, while his younger kids in Portland, who would have been teenagers, still needed him. I found emails between Walter and Caroline from as recently as a few months before he died. They were sweet and comfortable, like any long-married couple. But there was always this awareness that their life was a secret, that Walter was living 2 realities. The journals from Walter's final year showed him struggling with the weight of the deception. He'd built this elaborate structure to maintain both families, but he was tired. He wanted to tell the truth, but didn't know how without destroying everyone. That's why he left everything to me. Walter wrote that I was the only person in either family who might understand, who might be able to handle the truth and figure out what to do with it. I sat in Walter's secret apartment reading his life story, and I realized he'd basically made me the executor of his double life. Thanks, Grandpa.
I spent a week processing everything before I knew I had to do something. Walter had left me instructions, phone numbers, addresses, letters he'd written but never sent. He'd basically created a roadmap for me to unravel his life. The hardest part was figuring out what to do about Caroline and Walter's other kids. They existed, they'd loved Walter, and they deserved to know what happened to him. According to Walter's records, Caroline lived in Portland with Walter's daughter Sarah, who was 33. Walter's son Michael was 36 and lived in Seattle. Neither of them had any idea that Walter had a whole other family in Eugene. I found a letter Walter had written to Caroline but never sent. It explained everything: his first marriage, his other kids, the decades of deception. He'd written it 2 years ago, but apparently never worked up the courage to give it to her. I decided to go to Portland. Caroline's address led me to a beautiful craftsman house in a nice neighborhood. Walter's truck, or what I thought was Walter's truck, but was apparently a much newer version, was in the driveway. I sat in my car for 20 minutes trying to figure out what to say. "Hi, I'm your dead husband's grandson from his secret first family." Didn't seem like a great opener. Finally, I just knocked on the door. The woman who answered was in her early 60s, attractive, with kind eyes that immediately reminded me of how Walter looked in his happy photos. She smiled like she was greeting an expected guest. "You must be Thomas. Walter told me you might come." I was so surprised I just stood there. "I'm Caroline," she continued. "Would you like to come in? I think we have a lot to talk about." Caroline led me to a comfortable living room and made coffee like this was a normal social visit. Then she sat down and told me the most surprising thing of all. "I've known about Helen and your mother and uncle for 30 years, she said calmly. I must have looked shocked because she smiled sadly. Walter told me in 1993, when Sarah was 5, he'd been living this double life for 6 years, and he finally broke down and confessed everything. I was furious, obviously. I'd married a man who was already married. Our kids were, well, illegitimate is an old-fashioned word, but technically accurate. Why did you stay? I asked. Caroline sighed. I loved him, and he loved me, genuinely loved me in a way he said he'd never felt before. But more than that, I understood why he'd done it. Walter got trapped in a life that made him miserable, and instead of blowing everything up, he tried to maintain both. It was selfish and wrong, but it was also very Walter. She pulled out her own photo albums, and I saw the life Walter had lived in Portland. Birthday parties, school events, holidays, a whole parallel existence. Did your kids know? Not at first. Walter told Sarah and Michael when they were adults, about 10 years ago. They took it hard, especially Michael, but they understood that Walter had done his best to be a good father to all his children, even if the circumstances were unconventional. Caroline paused and looked at me carefully. Walter left you the Eugene house and all his papers, because he wanted someone from that family to know the truth. He left me and the kids the Portland house and the investment properties. He tried to be fair, even in death. Does my mom know? I asked. Not unless you've told her. Walter never could bring himself to tell his Eugene family. He thought it would destroy what little relationship he had with them. Is he right? I thought about my mom's complicated feelings about Walter, about my uncle's estrangement, about how the family had always felt like Walter was holding something back. Honestly, I think they'll be shocked, but not as surprised as they should be. Everyone always knew something was off about Walter. Caroline nodded. He was a man living in two worlds, and he never fully belonged in either. It ate at him, especially toward the end. She stood up and grabbed a box from the side table. Walter left you something else. He said you'd need it to understand the full story. Inside the box was another set of journals, these ones from the past few years, and a USB drive labeled, For Thomas, the Why.
I took Caroline's box home and spent the next few days reading Walter's final journals and watching the videos on the USB drive. The journals from Walter's last years were different from the earlier ones, less about logistics and more about reflection. Walter knew he was dying. He'd been diagnosed with cancer a year before and chose not to treat it. And he was trying to make sense of his life. One entry particularly stood out. People will think I was selfish, and maybe I was, but here's what they won't understand. I never stopped caring for Helen or my kids. I made sure they were provided for, that they never lacked anything. I showed up for what they needed, even if I couldn't give them everything they wanted. But with Caroline and her kids, I got to be who I actually was. Not the working-class factory guy who played it safe, but the person who took risks and built something. Both lives were real. Both families mattered. The tragedy is that I could never merge them. The USB drive contained videos Walter had recorded over his final months. They were addressed to me, and they explained everything. Walter talked about growing up poor in the 1940s, about his father's drinking and his mother's depression. He talked about how he'd promised himself he'd be stable and safe, which is why he took the factory job and married Helen, who wanted the same security he'd been raised without. But then the inheritance came, and Walter realized he could be more than just stable. He could build wealth, take risks, and create something. And Helen was terrified of that. Every conversation about money became a fight about security versus risk. I tried for 6 years to make her understand, Walter said in one video,
looking exhausted even in the recording. But Helen had her own trauma from growing up poor, and she couldn't see investment as anything but gambling. To her, keeping money safe meant never risking it. To me, keeping money safe meant making it grow. We were speaking different languages. Walter talked about meeting Caroline and finding someone who understood his ambitions, but by then he had kids, a life, commitments. I know what people will say. I should have divorced Helen and started over. But Tom, I loved those kids. Your mom was 15, your uncle was 12. Divorce would have destroyed them financially and emotionally. So I found another way. A wrong way, probably, but a way that let me be there for them while also building the life I wanted. The most emotional video was Walter talking about his relationship with me. "You're the only one who ever really talked to me without resentment or obligation," Walter said, and I could see tears in his eyes. "Your mom and uncle always felt like I was distant, and they were right. I was. I was living half a life with them. But you just accepted me as I was, even though you had no idea who I actually was. That's why I'm leaving this to you. Not because you deserve the burden, but because you might be able to understand it." Walter's final video was recorded 2 weeks before he died. He looked terrible. Thin, pale, barely able to sit up. He said, "The hardest part about dying is knowing that my death is going to force everyone to deal with the truth I couldn't tell them while I was alive. Both my families are going to find out about each other. They're going to be angry and hurt and confused, and I won't be there to explain or apologize." Walter looked directly at the camera. "Tom, I'm asking you to do something really difficult. I want you to bring both families together, not because they'll suddenly love each other or understand, but because they deserve to know the whole story. Caroline and your mom should meet. Your uncle and Michael should know they have a brother. Sarah should know she has a sister. I kept these worlds separate, but maybe you can help them find some kind of peace with it all." The video ended with Walter signing off. "I'm sorry for the mess I left you, but I trust you to handle it better than I ever could. Grandpa Walter." I sat in my apartment staring at the blank screen, realizing that Walter hadn't just left me a house and money, he'd left me the responsibility of revealing his double life to everyone he'd loved and lied to. Thanks again, Grandpa. It took me 6 weeks to work up the courage, but I finally organized what I started calling the Walter Summit, a meeting where both of Walter's families would learn the full truth. I started by telling my mom everything. She took it better than I expected, mainly because she'd always known something was off about Walter. "All those business trips and consulting work," she said, shaking her head. "We always knew he was lying about something. We just thought maybe he had a gambling problem or was bad with money. Never occurred to me that he might have an entire other family and secret fortune." My uncle was harder. He was angry. At Walter for the deception, at me for uncovering it, at himself for never pushing harder to understand why his father was so distant. But eventually, both of them agreed to meet Caroline and Walter's other kids. Partly because they were curious, partly because the inheritance situation required it, and partly because I think they wanted to understand who Walter really was. I arranged for everyone to meet at a neutral location, a conference room at my lawyer's office. Very romantic, I know, but better than trying to do this at someone's house. The day of the meeting, I got there early to set up. I had photos, documents, Walter's journals, edited for privacy, and the videos he'd recorded. I basically created a presentation about my grandfather's double life. My mom and uncle arrived first, both looking nervous. Then Caroline, Sarah, and Michael showed up. The two families looked at each other with this mixture of curiosity and wariness, like meeting aliens who somehow looked familiar. I started with the basics, the timeline, the money, the logistics. Then I showed Walter's videos where he explained his reasoning. Watching both families react to Walter's explanations was surreal. My mom cried. Caroline cried. My uncle looked angry.
Michael looked betrayed. Sarah just seemed sad. After the videos, everyone sat in silence for a while. Then my uncle spoke up. So Dad had enough money to send me to college debt-free, but he let me take out $80,000 in loans because he was pretending to be poor. Caroline looked uncomfortable. Walter did set up education funds for Sarah and Michael, but he told me he couldn't do the same for his Eugene family without revealing the money existed. That's bullshit, my uncle said. He chose you over us. He chose himself, Sarah said quietly. He built a life with my mom where he could be the person he wanted to be, and that meant he couldn't fully be present for either family. Michael added, "For what it's worth, we didn't exactly have the perfect father either. He was gone 3 days a week our entire childhood, and even when he was home, there was always this sense that part of him was somewhere else. Because part of him was with us," my mom said, but she sounded more sad than angry. The conversation went on for hours. Stories were shared, photos were compared, and slowly a picture emerged of Walter as a deeply flawed man who had tried to maintain 2 families, but ended up failing both of them in different ways. But something else happened too. The families started finding common ground. My uncle and Michael both had eerily similar stories about Walter teaching them to fix motorcycles. My mom and Sarah both remembered Walter's terrible dad jokes. Everyone had experienced his weird inability to express emotion directly. By the end of the meeting, nobody was happy about Walter's choices, but they understood him better. Caroline and my mom had a long conversation about loving the same complicated man. Michael and my uncle exchanged numbers. Sarah and my mom made plans to have coffee. The inheritance got divided fairly. My mom and uncle got the Eugene property and a share of Walter's investments. Caroline, Sarah, and Michael kept the Portland house and the remaining properties. I kept Walter's secret basement apartment and enough money to feel weird about for the rest of my life. But the strangest outcome was that Walter's 2 families, forced together by his death, actually became something like one extended family. Awkward and complicated, but real. We had Thanksgiving together last year, both of Walter's families, all in one place for the first time. It was weird and occasionally tense, but also kind of beautiful. We toasted Walter's memory with a mixture of forgiveness and frustration. To Walter, Caroline said, a man who loved too many people and wasn't brave enough to be honest about it. To Dad, my mom added, who was a terrible liar but somehow got away with it for 40 years. To Grandpa Walter, I said, who left me the world's most complicated inheritance and trusted me to figure it out. Looking around that table at 2 families trying to become one, I understood what Walter was trying to do all along. He couldn't choose between the life he had and the life he wanted, so he tried to have both. It was selfish and wrong and incredibly human. And somehow, by dying and forcing us all to confront his impossible choice, he'd given both of his families something he could never give them while alive: the truth and the chance to understand him completely.